What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
You think you can bury the truth like you buried my husband, but some secrets won't stay underground forever. Those words would echo through the abandoned mine shafts of Millfield, West Virginia, but that confrontation was still weeks away. The story really began on a gray October morning when Harriet Voss opened her mailbox to find another disappointment waiting inside. The pension check was lighter again, $37 less than last month, which had already been $42 short of what it should have been. Harriet stood on her front porch, the morning mist clinging to the mountains around her small town, and felt the familiar knot of anger tighten in her chest. 3 years since her husband Daniel had died in that mine collapse, and every month brought new struggles to make ends meet. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. At 57, Harriet had the weathered hands and steely gaze of someone who'd spent decades fighting for what was right. After Daniel's death, she'd thrown herself into mine safety advocacy, determined that no other family would suffer what hers had. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she favored sturdy boots and flannel shirts that could handle the rough terrain of her mountain home. She walked the half-mile into town, her breath visible in the crisp air. Millfield had once been a thriving mining community, but now half the storefronts stood empty, their windows reflecting the skeletal remains of the old mining equipment that still dotted the hillsides like monuments to a dying industry. The one business that still seemed to prosper was Blackstone Mining, their gleaming new headquarters a stark contrast to the faded buildings around it. Harriet's jaw tightened as she passed the Blackstone building. She knew exactly who ran that company now, Clayton Burke, her late sister's ex-husband and the last person on earth she'd wanted to see succeed. Clayton had been bad news from the day he'd married Patricia 15 years ago. The marriage had lasted only 3 years, ending when Patricia finally got tired of his controlling behavior and constant criticism. But somehow, Clayton had managed to charm his way into a management position at Blackstone, and when the previous owner retired, he'd bought the company with money that Patricia always suspected came from shady dealings. The bell above Meredith's diner chimed as Harriet pushed through the door. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon wrapped around her like a warm hug, and she spotted her usual breakfast companion already waiting in their corner booth. Ruth Crawford was 62, her silver hair always perfectly styled, despite their modest circumstances. She'd lost her husband Tom in the same mine collapse that took Daniel, and the two women had bonded over their shared grief and determination to honor their husbands' memories. Ruth had been the school secretary for 30 years before retiring, and she still had the organized mind and gentle demeanor that had made her beloved by generations of students. "Another short check?" Ruth asked, reading Harriet's expression as she slid into the booth. $37 this time. Harriet accepted the cup of coffee that appeared at her elbow, courtesy of Jenny, the young waitress who'd known both women since childhood. "How about you?" Ruth's face darkened. 50, too short. I called the pension office yesterday, and they gave me some runaround about administrative adjustments and processing fees. When I asked to speak to someone in charge, they put me on hold for 20 minutes and then hung up. That's the 3rd month in a row you've been shorted. Harriet leaned forward, lowering her voice. And it's not just us. I ran into Karen Willis at the grocery store Tuesday, and she said her check was light too. So was Dolores Martinez's. The two women sat in contemplative silence for a moment, watching the morning rush of workers heading to their jobs. Most of them worked for Blackstone now. It was one of the few employers left in the county that paid a living wage. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Ruth said finally. Tom used to say something was fishy about the way Clayton handled the pension fund paperwork. This was right before the accident. He said Clayton was always very secretive about those files, wouldn't let anyone else touch them. Harriet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Daniel mentioned something similar. Said Clayton would take those files home sometimes, claimed he was streamlining the process. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, Harriet's nephew and one of the few young people who'd chosen to stay in Millfield after college. At 28, Jake had his mother's earnest brown eyes and his late father's broad shoulders. He worked as a union organizer, traveling throughout the region to help mining communities advocate for better working conditions and fair wages. "Morning, Aunt Harriet." Ruth. Jake kissed his aunt's cheek before sliding into the booth beside her. "You two look like you're plotting something." "Just trying to figure out why the pension checks keep getting smaller," Harriet said. Jake's expression grew serious. "Actually, that's something I've been hearing about in other towns too. Widow benefits getting mysteriously reduced, administrative fees that nobody can explain. It's happening in 3 different counties that I know of." "All Blackstone communities?" Ruth asked. "Every single one." Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through some notes. "I've been documenting it for the union, thinking it might be worth investigating. Some of these women are losing hundreds of dollars a month." Harriet felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same anger that had driven her to become a safety advocate after Daniel's death. Then maybe it's time someone did more than just document it. That afternoon, Harriet found herself walking the familiar path to the old mine entrance where Daniel had worked. The site had been sealed after the collapse, but she came here often to think and to feel close to him. The autumn leaves crunched under her feet as she made her way through the woods, the sound echoing off the surrounding mountains. She wasn't surprised to find fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the mine entrance. Blackstone still owned this land, and they occasionally sent crews out to check the security fencing. What did surprise her was seeing Clayton Burke's expensive SUV parked beside the chain-link fence that surrounded the sealed mine shaft. Harriet ducked behind a cluster of pine trees and watched as Clayton emerged from the woods, carrying a metal briefcase and looking around nervously. He was still handsome in a polished way, his dark hair graying at the temples and his clothes obviously expensive. But Harriet could see the cruel set of his mouth, the same expression that had made her sister's life miserable for 3 years. Clayton approached a section of the fence that had been cut and bent back, creating an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. He glanced around once more, then disappeared through the gap. Harriet waited for nearly an hour before Clayton emerged again, this time without the briefcase. He looked satisfied as he walked back to his SUV, pulling out his phone to make a call. "Everything's secure?" she heard him say as the wind carried his voice across the clearing. Even if someone suspected, they'd never risk going down there. The whole area's been marked unstable. As Clayton drove away, Harriet remained hidden among the trees, her mind racing. What was he hiding at the sealed mine site? And why did his conversation sound so ominous? That evening, she called Jake and Ruth, asking them to meet her at her house. Her small home was filled with mementos of her life with Daniel, photographs of their wedding day, his mining helmet displayed on the mantelpiece, his favorite coffee mug that she still couldn't bring herself to put away. "I think Clayton is hiding something at the old mine site," she told them, describing what she'd witnessed that afternoon. Jake frowned. "That doesn't make sense. The site is supposed to be completely sealed. It's been deemed too unstable for anyone to enter safely." "Maybe that's exactly why he chose it," Ruth said quietly. "Nobody would think to look there." "Look for what?" Jake asked. "Evidence," Harriet said. "Ruth, you said Tom mentioned Clayton being secretive about pension paperwork. What if he's been skimming money from the widow benefits and hiding the proof somewhere he thought no one would ever find it?" The 3 of them spent the next hour discussing the possibility. Jake had contacts in the union who could help investigate, but they would need concrete evidence before anyone would take action against someone as powerful as Clayton Burke. There's something else, Ruth said hesitantly. I never mentioned this before because it seemed too crazy, but after Tom died, I found some papers hidden in his toolbox. Financial documents that he'd apparently taken from work. I couldn't make sense of them at the time, so I put them away. Where? Harriet asked urgently. In the old storage cache at the number 3 shaft. Tom used to keep extra supplies there during the winter months. He thought it would be safer than leaving them at home where they might get lost or damaged. Jake looked confused. Number 3 shaft? I thought all the mines in this area were sealed. The main entrances are, Harriet explained, but miners always had backup supply caches, especially during the winter months when weather could cut off access for weeks. Tom and Daniel used the same cache. It's in a stable section about a quarter-mile from the main shaft. And you think those papers might prove Clayton's been embezzling? Jake asked. There's only one way to find out, Ruth said. But I haven't been back there since Tom died. I'm not even sure I could find it again. I could, Harriet said quietly. Daniel took me there once, showed me where he kept emergency supplies. He said if anything ever happened, I should know where to find them. The next few days passed in a blur of careful planning. Jake used his union connections to quietly gather information about the pension fund discrepancies, while Harriet and Ruth reached out to other mining widows to document their experiences. What they discovered was shocking. Over the past 3 years, dozens of women had seen their benefits reduced by amounts ranging from $30 to over $100 per month. If our calculations are right, Jake said during one of their evening meetings, Clayton could have stolen close to $500,000 from these families. Money that was supposed to help women whose husbands died, keeping his mine profitable, Ruth added bitterly. Harriet felt the anger burning in her chest like a coal fire. These were families who were already struggling, women who had lost everything and were trying to rebuild their lives on the modest benefits their husbands had earned through years of dangerous work. On Friday morning, Harriet received a phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Voss, this is Detective Palmer from the County Sheriff's Office. I understand you've been asking questions about pension fund irregularities. Harriet's blood ran cold. Yes, that's right. Why? I've received a complaint from Clayton Burke at Blackstone Mining. He says you've been harassing his employees and spreading false rumors about company finances. He's asked us to speak with you about stopping this behavior. Harassment? Harriet's voice rose. I've been talking to widows who are having their benefits illegally reduced. Mr. Burke assures me that any discrepancies are due to legitimate administrative adjustments. He's provided documentation showing that the pension fund is being managed properly. After the detective hung up, Harriet sat in her kitchen, shaking with rage. Clayton was using his connections to intimidate her, just like he'd intimidated her sister years ago. But this time, he'd picked the wrong woman to bully. That afternoon, she found her front window broken and a note on her front steps. Stop digging or you'll end up like your husband. When Jake arrived that evening and saw the damage, his face went white with anger. We're calling the police right now. No point, Harriet said grimly. Clayton's already got them convinced I'm the troublemaker. But this just proves we're on the right track. Ruth arrived shortly after, carrying a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. I've been thinking about those papers Tom hid. If they're really evidence of Clayton's crimes, we need to get them before he figures out they exist. The cache is in an unstable mine shaft, Jake protested. It's too dangerous. I've been in and out of these mines for 20 years, Harriet said. I know how to stay safe, and we need that evidence. They spent the weekend gathering supplies and studying old mining maps that Jake had obtained through the union. The number 3 shaft had been partially collapsed in a different accident years before Daniel's death, but there were still accessible tunnels that led to the storage areas. On Monday morning, while Clayton was at a mining conference in Charleston, the 3 of them set out for the mountains. Their first attempt led them to a dead end where tunnel supports had given way completely, forcing them to backtrack and try a different route. But Harriet's knowledge of the mine layout proved invaluable as she guided them through alternative passages. "This way," she said, consulting her memory of conversations with Daniel. "There's another entrance about 200 yards north. It should connect to the same tunnel system." The entrance to number 3 shaft was hidden behind a screen of overgrown bushes and hadn't been used in over a decade. Harriet led the way, her mining helmet's light cutting through the darkness as they descended into the tunnels that had once been her husband's workplace. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of coal and limestone. Their footsteps echoed off the tunnel walls, and Harriet could hear the distant sound of water dripping from the ceiling. These mines held so many memories of Daniel coming home exhausted but proud of his work, of the community that had been built around the dangerous but necessary job of extracting coal from the mountain's heart. "This way," she called softly, leading them down a side tunnel that sloped gently upward. "The cache should be about 50 yards ahead." The storage area was exactly as she remembered it, a natural cave that had been reinforced with timber supports and lined with metal shelving. Emergency supplies were still stored here: flashlights, first aid kits, emergency food rations, and tools for digging out of cave-ins. Ruth went directly to a locked metal box on the highest shelf. "Tom's emergency kit," she explained, pulling out a key that she wore on a chain around her neck. "He always said this was the safest place to keep anything important." Inside the box, beneath layers of emergency supplies, they found a waterproof pouch containing a manila envelope with dozens of financial documents. Bank statements, pension fund transfer records, and photocopied checks showed a clear pattern of money being diverted from the widow benefit accounts into personal accounts controlled by Clayton Burke. "This is it," Jake breathed, photographing each document with his phone. "This proves everything. He's been stealing from these families for years." "Look at this," Ruth said, pointing to a handwritten note in Tom's careful script. He was tracking Clayton's movements, documenting when money went missing. Harriet felt tears burning her eyes as she read her husband's friend's meticulous notes. Tom had known something was wrong and had been trying to gather evidence when he died. Just like Daniel, he'd been trying to protect his community even as Clayton's negligence and corner-cutting made their work more dangerous every day. "We need to get this to the authorities," Jake said. "The real authorities, not the local police who are in Clayton's pocket." As they prepared to leave the mine, Harriet heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of voices echoing through the tunnels, coming from the direction they'd entered. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. They quickly packed the documents and turned off their lights, listening as the voices grew closer. Harriet recognized Clayton's voice, along with 2 other men she didn't know. "I'm telling you, someone's been asking too many questions," Clayton was saying. "That widow has been talking to people, gathering information. I came here to check on those other files I moved from the office, but they're gone." "Should have dealt with her the same way we dealt with her husband," one of the other men replied coldly. Harriet felt Jake tense beside her. The implication was clear: Daniel's death hadn't been an accident. "The collapse took care of the immediate problem," Clayton continued. "But if anyone finds those documents, we're all going to prison. Tom was too smart for his own good, keeping copies of everything." The voices were getting closer. Harriet made a quick decision, leading Ruth and Jake deeper into the mine, toward a section where she hoped they could find another way out. They moved as quietly as possible, but the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo impossibly loudly in the confined space. Behind them, they heard Clayton curse. "Fresh footprints! Someone's been here recently." "Spread out," another voice commanded. "Check every tunnel." Harriet's heart pounded as she led her companions through the maze of mining tunnels, relying on instincts and memories that were years old. Behind them, the voices grew closer and more urgent. She could hear Clayton directing his men to split up and search different passages. "This way," she whispered, leading them toward what she hoped was still a functioning section of the mine. As they reached a junction where several tunnels met, Harriet spotted something that made her heart leap with hope: an old emergency water control valve mounted on the tunnel wall. Daniel had explained these systems to her years ago, how they could divert underground streams to flood certain sections in case of fire or gas buildup. Daniel always said these old mines had emergency flood controls, she whispered to Jake and Ruth. Let's see if this one still works. With Clayton's men getting closer, Harriet grabbed the heavy wheel valve and began turning it with all her strength. At first nothing happened, but then she heard the distant rumble of water beginning to flow through hidden pipes. Within minutes, a rush of cold mountain water came surging through the connecting tunnel, creating an impassable barrier between them and their pursuers. Clayton's angry shouts echoed from the other side as the water level rose, forcing him and his men to retreat to higher ground. The emergency water system had bought them precious time. Harriet led Jake and Ruth through the flooded section to a secondary exit that was narrow and partially blocked by fallen rocks, but they managed to squeeze through into the gray afternoon light. My truck is parked about a mile down the mountain, Jake whispered. We need to move fast. As they hurried through the woods, Harriet could hear Clayton and his men searching the mine behind them. She knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered the secondary exit and came after them. They reached Jake's truck just as the first of Clayton's men emerged from the tree line. Jake gunned the engine and they sped down the winding mountain road as their pursuers ran back toward their own vehicles. We need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it immediately, Harriet said, clutching the manila envelope. Clayton knows we have it now. Jake was already on his phone, calling his union contacts. Within an hour, they were sitting in the office of a federal prosecutor in the state capitol, presenting their evidence to a woman who specialized in white-collar crime and corruption. Attorney General Sandra Kim was a small woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened intently as they explained their discoveries, examining each document with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. This is substantial evidence of embezzlement and fraud, she said finally. But I'm concerned about your safety. If Mr. Burke is willing to threaten you directly, he may escalate to more serious action. He already has, Harriet said grimly. We overheard him talking about my husband's death not being an accident. Attorney General Kim's expression hardened. In that case, we need to move quickly. I'm going to request warrants for Mr. Burke's arrest and to search Blackstone Mining's financial records. But I need you three to stay somewhere safe until we can take him into custody. That evening, Harriet found herself in a hotel room 50 miles from home, watching the news with Ruth and Jake as reporters described the shocking allegations of fraud and corruption that had rocked the small mining community of Millfield. Clayton Burke's arrest had been swift and dramatic. Federal agents had surrounded the Blackstone headquarters just as he was attempting to shred documents and delete computer files. The evidence they'd recovered confirmed everything that Tom's hidden papers had suggested. Clayton had been systematically stealing from widow pension funds for nearly 4 years, diverting over $600,000 into offshore accounts. The investigation is ongoing, the news anchor reported, but preliminary findings suggest that dozens of mining families may have been victimized by this scheme. 3 days later, Harriet was back home, but everything had changed. The story had made national news, bringing attention to the broader issue of pension fraud in mining communities. Jake had been contacted by union organizers from across the country, asking for help in investigating similar crimes. Ruth had become something of a local hero, praised for her courage in preserving the evidence that had brought Clayton down. But she remained modest about her role, insisting that Tom deserved the credit for having the foresight to document Clayton's crimes. I just kept what my husband thought was important, she told the reporters who came to interview her. He's the one who knew something was wrong. For Harriet, the satisfaction of seeing Clayton arrested was tempered by the revelation of her husband's true fate. The investigation had revealed that Clayton had known about the structural problems that led to the mine collapse weeks before it happened. He'd chosen to continue operations rather than pay for the repairs that might have saved Daniel's life and the lives of 2 other miners. He's being charged with criminally negligent homicide, Attorney General Kim told her during one of their follow-up meetings, "The evidence shows he knowingly put those men in danger to avoid the cost of proper safety measures." The civil lawsuit that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and federal charges, Blackstone Mining agreed to a settlement that not only returned all the stolen pension money, but included additional damages for the pain and suffering Clayton had caused. The company itself was dissolved, its assets sold to pay the settlement and legal fees. Clayton Burke was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, and criminally negligent homicide. The judge's remarks during sentencing were scathing, noting that he had betrayed the trust of families who had already sacrificed everything for his company's profits. 6 months after Clayton's arrest, Harriet stood in the community center of Millfield, surrounded by dozens of mining families who had gathered for a memorial service. The room was decorated with photographs of the miners who had died over the years, including Daniel and Tom, and the walls were lined with displays showing the history of mining in the region. "We're here today not just to remember those we've lost," Harriet said, addressing the crowd, "but to celebrate the fact that their sacrifices led to justice for our community." The settlement money had transformed Millfield. The Widow Pension Fund had been fully restored and placed under federal oversight to prevent future fraud. A new mining safety training center had been established, funded by the settlement, to ensure that future generations of miners would have the knowledge and tools to protect themselves. Ruth had been elected to the town council, where she worked to attract new businesses and improve services for families. Jake had been offered a position with the Federal Department of Labor, helping to investigate similar cases of pension fraud in mining communities across the country. For Harriet, the greatest satisfaction came from the Mining Safety Advocacy Center that now bore Daniel's name. Located in the renovated Blackstone headquarters building, the Daniel Voss Safety Center provided training, resources, and legal assistance to mining families throughout the region. "Your husband would be proud," Ruth told her as they stood together at the memorial wall, looking at Daniel's photograph alongside those of the other fallen miners. "I think he'd be proud of all of us," Harriet replied. "We didn't let Clayton bury the truth with them." As the memorial service continued around them, Harriet felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since Daniel's death. The fight for justice had been long and dangerous, but it had brought their community together and ensured that future families wouldn't suffer the same betrayals they had endured. Outside the community center, the mountains of West Virginia rose against the autumn sky, their slopes scarred by decades of mining but still beautiful and strong. Like the people who called this place home, they had endured hardship and loss, but remained standing, testament to the power of resilience and the unbreakable bonds of community. The echoes of the mine would always carry the voices of those who had worked and died in its depths, but now they also carried the promise that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Justice had been served, and the community they had helped build would continue to thrive, protected by the courage of those who refused to let the truth stay buried. Later that evening, Harriet visited Daniel's grave for the first time since Clayton's arrest. The cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of a mourning dove. "We did it," she said softly, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. "Clayton paid for what he did to you, to Tom, to all of us. The families are getting their money back, and there are new safety rules to protect the miners who come after." As she turned to leave, Harriet felt a sense of closure that had been missing for 3 long years. The fight for justice was over, but the work of building a better future for their community was just beginning. And she knew that Daniel would have wanted her to be part of that future, using the strength she'd found in seeking justice to help others who needed someone to stand up for them. The mountains held their secrets close, but some truths were too important to stay buried forever. In Millfield, West Virginia, the echoes of the mine would always carry the story of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice, who risked everything to protect their community, and who proved that even the most powerful men couldn't escape the consequences of their crimes when good people stood together and demanded the truth. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.